The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
And it's good to have you with us here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Robert Cornegy, Reverend Karl, and also Bishop Doc Loomis, as we take a look at different issues and articles that have come out in the last week and how it relates to our faith. Let's begin with first of all, good day, gentlemen. Hope everyone is okay.
Morning, Ben.
Good morning.
Let's start with one from the Stream and the stream.org or stream.org, but it's entitled The 100-Year War Against the Unborn. The 100-Year War began by Sanger and has reached in zenith a holocaust of unimaginable proportions. That's the subtitle of this article. Linda Royale writes, the longest war in the history of the planet Earth churns on, claiming just since 1980 more than 1.5 billion babies. In the United States alone, about 60 million innocent unborn have been legally slaughtered since the legalization of abortion in 1973. The number of casualties of all the world's wars in the history of the world is estimated somewhat less than 500 million, less than one-third of the amount of unborn lives sacrificed in the last 36 years. Only winners in this war are the abortion industry moguls who make money coming and going off of mostly government-provided funds for abortion, or worse yet, from the lucrative process of harvesting, brokering, buying, selling, and providing commercial laboratories and industries the carcasses of the war dead. Many of these organizations operate from federal funds and grants. Okay, now this is obviously not a news piece in that sense of let's look back at the 100 years of Planned Parenthood and its original manifestations under Margaret Sanger. It's obviously a piece that has its own opinion there too. But Robert, you've worked in this area of ministry for a long time about protecting the unborn.
Yeah.
So what is your impression? Does she have this right in classifying this as a war on the unborn?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I go back about 30 years in this, a little bit further. But watching what has happened in the last 30 years, to the response as well as the aggression. I mean, when you think about it, 1.5 billion lives have been lost worldwide to abortion. I mean, 60 million here in the United States since Roe v. Wade. 60 million. I was at a conference, a national apologetics conference this weekend, and I did a talk on this very issue. And it was the battle between the culture of life and the culture of death, using Deuteronomy where the Lord says, I lay before you blessing and cursing, life and death. Mm-hmm. Choose life. And he actually gave us the choice, didn't he? That's what evil is making the wrong choice. And so we have seen the impact of the culture of death around the world. And it's hidden. It's not talked about. And when Roe v. Wade was passed, those that rose against it and refused to accept it as law, it was like the Dred Scott case. It was where a human being was being declared that it had no constitutional rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And so this happened at Roe v. Wade in the United States, and that's obviously been occurring all over the world. But that is when the stake was driven in the ground, and the pro-life movement really came into its own. And we've been fighting the battle ever since, and in lots of different fronts. And we've been fighting the war. We've won some battles. Mm-hmm. We have. I mean, Jay Sekulow was one of the lead speakers of the the
American Family Association?
No, this is the ACLU, the opposite of that, ACLJ.
Right.
And they do a lot of work in this area. And he said this is one of the victories over the last 30 years for our side, is how the millennials coming up. The question about the science is settled. It was settled before 72. And all this is fascinating. In the science books, before 72, it said that life begins at conception until 73, when Roe v. Wade passed, and they started changing the books, saying that it doesn't begin at conception. It begins at birth. And so this is the kind of battle that's been going on. So Sanger was the absolute evangelist of the culture of death. She went all over the world proselytizing, and we are seeing the consequences of it now. One of the biggest industries in the world is baby parts.
Well, let's move from here and to look back here now 100 years later at where Planned Parenthood and its role in our American political life as well as in our American social life. And first of all, is there a distinction? Let me turn to either one of you guys after that passionate remarks there. But is there a distinction between what we are saying in church and maybe what we say in the public square about abortion, about woman's control of her own body? I mean, Karl, in Methodism, there's been some conflicting words about that. And challenges to that.
Yes, and where it gets difficult is where the politics of the issue get involved, because certainly I believe that life begins at conception, and certainly I believe that an abortion is a murder of a child, and I believe that every life is precious in God's eyes, whether that person has been born or whether that person has yet to be born. We see scripture where God said to, I believe it was Jeremiah, before you were formed in the womb, I knew you. I had great plans for you. And that person doesn't even get an opportunity because somebody else makes a choice to snuff out that life. And but we start to talk about that, and there are people with very strong opinions on both sides of the issue. But I'm afraid that the opinions become more of a political opinion, and actually a very selfish opinion as well. And that's what makes it hard to have. It's what makes it hard to have calm, reasoned discussions about it, because people feel so strongly. They're quick to jump on their soapbox and say, oh, no, you're wrong. This, and this. I have these rights. And then someone else says, but what about the rights of the child? And then there's no conversation happening, just shouting.
Yeah, Doc, this is, again, probably one of the most difficult subjects of our life, and our life in ministry and our life in this world. But it's also, I think, a difficult subject to distinguish between what someone considers to be a sin versus what someone wants to make a crime. And that, I think that becomes part of the heart of the difficulty of this issue. What do you think?
I think God thinks it's a sin, and I think he's a just God. And I think that, as Christian persons or as followers of God, we should try to allow the justice that we employ to be a reflection of his justice. God made it very clear in 100 verses in the Old and New Testament that the fruit of the womb, that what was in the womb was his greatest joy. So it is a war against the unborn. You asked Robert that earlier, yes, but this is a war directly against God.
Right.
This is the difference between him, the creator, and we, the destroyer. It's a battle that's gone on since the beginning of time. And to wage destruction against God's creation never ends well for a people. The book is full of stories about people who tried to destroy what the Lord had hoped to create. And he always does win. And I think one of the challenges with the church right now is that we probably don't, I don't actually speak that much about abortion. I speak a lot more about the creative love of our Creator and what is His desire for each life and how that life looks to Him in the womb and out. And I think right now, it's really what surprises me is, you guys were reading all these numbers here at the beginning of this article and how many. We are a people that should not just be fighting back against abortion, but we should be on our faces in sackcloth, covering ourselves with ashes and wailing before the Lord and begging Him to forgive us for what we've done to His creation. This is a deep, deep sadness, and it hurts me that I don't think that the church as a whole feels this sadness. Do you know what I mean, Robert?
Oh,
I see
absolutely.
people that are very involved like you, and I know you go home and pray about it and your heart hurts, but I don't see that same hurt in the church. That hurt when Jesus looked over Jerusalem and He said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you have stoned the prophets. How I long to gather you together like a mother hen, her chicks beneath her wings." That kind of weeping and wailing, the church doesn't reflect that in our society today, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. But also, I think that we have that hard discussion to say, well, what does the mother say here? Where is the mother in all this in terms of protecting her own unborn and also the grief of an unwanted child that she experiences? I know with the Pregnancy Center, they deal a lot with women who have guilty feelings afterwards. We'll talk more about this after this break here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, along with the Reverend Robert Cornegay, Bishop Doc Loomis, and Reverend Karl Zorowski. And as we talked about the 100th anniversary of Planned Parenthood and now about abortion, and we began, Robert, with you're impassioned about this subject. I think what we come to see, as I see, maybe you all agree or not, in a lot of churches, that people individually will speak about abortion possibly as a sin, but then they say, what about the mother? Doesn't she have something to say about this? And
yeah, of course, and that is why the Pregnancy Center ministry, began in the mid '80s, was because it was a response. The original kind of pushback on the decision of Roe v. Wade was a political one. And it was right to life movement. It was primarily a Catholic response. There were not many Protestant churches involved in that response. In fact, many of the mainline churches were pretty much silent denominations on this, and in fact supported it in many ways until the political side started getting some public attention. And then it started changing, and more Protestants. I remember when I first started going to the Right to Life movements, the meetings here in Moorhead, that there were only a couple of Protestants in the. It was meeting at the Catholic Church, and there were only a couple of Protestant pastors in there. I wasn't a pastor then, but a layman. But so it has changed over the years, and in '66 is when it basically a lot of the shift came in towards. Or responding to the women, the mothers that are in this situation, and building a safety net around them so that they would have a support team to be able to walk through this process. And I think that really was the you need both. You need the political activity as well as the social activity in it. But as far as a ground changing the hearts. Typically, it doesn't happen in the political side. You may change some laws and stuff like that, but and you have to have that there. But as we've done the social side of it, the pregnancy care center programs, that is where the hearts have been changed, and educating in the school system, abstinence only. North Carolina. 2009. Up until recently, the standard was abstinence until marriage. Has been, still is right now. That hasn't been changed. Now there's a movement to try to shift that a little bit, but that has reinforced what they've been seeing in science. I mean, like I said earlier, the science is clear. Now there's no argument there, and now the question is in the moral area, and this is an area the church has always been activists in, the moral side of it. And so what is how do we handle this? How do we, as believers that we were created in the image of God. And now we're seeing an industry develop that is literally disassembling the image of God and selling it on the marketplace. I mean, this is the ugly, ugly truth of Planned Parenthood. That, they do mammograms and they do all this other stuff, but they are the largest abortion provider in the United States and moving to the world. They have a huge international program. And the UN, American State Department, are all involved in this, in forcing this culture of death on politically around the world.
The origins of Planned Parenthood, you go back to Margaret Sanger, and Margaret Sanger was openly a eugenicist, and also believed that some were fit and some were unfit,
right?
And that while she promoted birth control, this is really before abortion became the word really so much, but promoted birth control as a measure of controlling population. It wasn't just population in general, it was a population. I was reading an article from her that she talks about race regeneration and talking about race degeneration taking place in the current wave of people who were of lower class and who lower mentality, who are having so many babies. And so her idea was about protecting a class of people, which is interesting. How that now does that relate though to where we are now with Planned Parenthood, or is it just abortion on demand changed that picture after Roe v. Wade, changed the understanding of what that meant for population control?
The majority of Planned Parenthood clinics, all you have to do is look at a map. Where are they? And they're in the cities, in the population centers, in the lower quadrants, if you will, of the population of those cities. That's where they are. And it's a strategy that has been there from the beginning. And it is, I'm just going to say it, it's racist. I mean, it's part of that eugenics thinking that you can design human beings. You can eliminate the impurities. This is what she did a tour in the early 1900s, came back in 1916, and that's when she went political. And and during that tour, she was in Europe. She went all over, but she was primarily in Europe. And we saw a huge shift towards eugenics thinking in the intellectuals of European intellectuals. And this is right out of this is where the whole German experiment with eugenics experiment of customizing, creating the perfect race came about. So, look, I mean, this organization, Planned Parenthood, and all the things that have sprung out of it is entirely wicked, and should be resisted. And the fact that we have a political party in their platform promoting this should be sufficient to help people make decisions about how they vote politically.
Any other thoughts on that here this morning? I was reading in an article that she did after World War II in actually 1921, is the eugenic value of birth control propaganda that she wrote. And she says near the end of it, says, birth control is not advanced as a panacea by which past and present evils of dysgenic breeding can be magically eliminated. Possibly drastic and Spartan methods may be forced upon society if it continues complacently to encourage the chance and chaotic breeding that has resulted from our stupidly cruel sentimentalism. That's really quite stark.
To politicians, people have become a commodity, something to be bought and sold and traded in. And politics handles babies like the Division of Marine Fishery handles fish. When there's too many of a certain kind, we increase the limit. When there's too few, we reduce the limit. And you don't do that unless it's a commodity. You don't do that unless it's something to be exchanged. And the devaluation of human beings into nothing more or less than a political economic item is a commodity is just, I think, the most frightening thing about what Planned Parenthood has been able to do. They've significantly influenced our view of humans as something to be bought, sold, and traded.
Yeah. And doesn't that really open the door to what the church needs to do? The church needs to help people understand the value of a human life. And I truly believe that if an individual comes into a relationship with Jesus Christ and their heart is transformed, they have a whole new view of God, they have a whole new view of the sanctity of life, and one by one, the world is going to be changed. And instead of worrying about incorporating new laws, we're going to be looking at new hearts. Ben, I think you said something one time about we don't need to change laws, we need to change hearts. And that's where the church comes in. Because Planned Parenthood, we're talking about this organization in some form or another has now been around for 100 years. It's probably going to be around for another 100 years. And each person that goes in there is a life that could be changed through an encounter with Jesus Christ, and that's where the church needs to step up to the plate.
Well, it's a great analogy. It's funny how we kind of go blind on these things. That when murder, how do we consider murder, someone rape and murder? I mean, this is horrible.
It's a horrible thing.
We don't issue any grace on that, do we?
No.
I mean, there are some mitigating circumstances, but typically we have laws that are very specific and very you have to conform to the law. You don't make the law conform to your. That's why justice has a blindfold. And what we have seen is that we've got all this we've allowed grayness into these areas, and we're reaping that when you sow to the wind, you reap the whirlwind. And we are now reaping the whirlwind because we allowed this whole idea of truth is somewhat relative and somewhat, your truth may be a little different than my truth. And so, we can compensate. But yeah, I personally am against abortion, but you might be for it. So I'm not going to force my opinion on you. Well, wait a minute. There is a truth out there that is, we have to tie that one down, and live by it.
But the problem is, on both sides of this issue, you have people who are trying to force their opinion on the other people, on the other party. And you're never going to convince somebody through force. Okay, they may give up. They may give in, say, all right, fine, I'll agree with you. I'll take your stand. But if their heart has been changed, if their heart has been transformed, then they will see what is the real truth. We have one of the candidates has said that, our religious beliefs need to be changed for the sake of abortion. No, I think our hearts need to be changed. That's what needs to be changed.
We'll have more to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, along with Bishop Doc Loomis, Reverend Karl and Reverend Robert Cornegie. And we're talking about different issues around the nation, around the world. And this one comes from the religion section of the Federalist and also from the Ridley Institute. We'll start with the Federalist article first because it's talking about a Lifeway survey. And it says, and I love the headline because it's great clickbait. If it shows up in a feed somewhere, you're definitely going to click on this one. It says, survey finds most American Christians are actually heretics. Americans talking about theology sound as competent as country singers rapping, as the subtitle, which I thought that was great just right off the bat. Evangelical writer Erica Metaxas remarked on Breakpoint last week that if Americans took a theology exam, their only hope of passing would be if God graded on a curve. He's right in knowing both the content of the Bible and the doctrinal foundations of Christianity. We Americans aren't just at the bottom of our class. We are, as Ross Douthat argues in his book Bad Religion, a nation of heretics. He goes on to talk about this survey from Lifeway Research of 3,000 people. And then there's another article, too, from the Ridley Institute that comments on the article and also on the survey as well, and has some questions about how they even ask their questions. But at the heart of this, Doc, this is about how, as Christians, most of us in the pew and many of us in the pulpit are just woefully misinformed or uninformed. Or I think, what was it I said in prepping this? Somebody said a mile wide and an inch deep.
Yes, for lack of a catechism, the people perish. That's or the parish perishes. I mean, that's where we are right now in this country and across the world. The church discontinued to a large degree, not the Catholic Church, bless them, but most Protestantism discontinued to a large degree the use of any kind of a catechism, whether it was Luther's or the catechism that's found in the Book of Common Prayer among the Anglicans. So we don't actually teach the essentials of the faith in ways that are meaningful, memorable. We just don't do it. And so it's we have cute little things we do in church, like we have the Nicene Creed that we read every week. The Nicene Creed lays out very clearly the articles of our belief, the very foundations of our doctrine. And we say it every week, and yet this article mentioned in particular a finding among evangelicals that these people really believed in a triune God. What was it, 70% of the people believed in a triune God, and yet about 61% of those same folks actually believe that there are many other gods that with which we can access eternity and abundant living. So the fact that we're not teaching the very fundamentals of our faith should be disturbing at the very least. And there's a very easy remedy. The easy remedy is for churches to begin once again doing what Jesus said, and that's discipling people, laying out for them the catechism of the church as it's been handed down to us from our early church fathers, and telling people things the way they actually are and the way that 2,000 years of Christendom has handed them to us. They basically handed us the beauty of the education and the clarity that would mitigate this problem in our society, and we've just put that book on a shelf and laid it down and said, not so much. I think this week I'm going to teach on the prodigal son. A lovely story, but where's the depth of our faith? It's not there any longer.
Karl, we can do classes on the Book of Discipline. We should do that, shouldn't we?
Well, I actually do that.
Yeah.
I have classes on the Book of Discipline. I taught a class during the summer year before last on what we believe as United Methodists. And within that class, we talked about what we believe about God, what do we believe about Jesus, what do we believe about the Holy Spirit, and how they work in our lives. Doc had mentioned the Nicene Creed. Every week as part of our worship service, we use the Apostles' Creed or some other creed as a time where we say, let us affirm our belief and say what we believe. Because if a people is not reminded of what it is they believe, they're going to forget.
Robert, I think one of the criticisms I remember reading some time ago of evangelical community, this is long before this kind of survey or thing was written, was that the basic understanding of no creed but Jesus, and then the idea is that people don't need to have that sort of depth of understanding besides knowing that Jesus is your Savior.
Well, there was a shift in the way we communicate in our whole education process, away from the fundamentals of in classical education, everyone was broadly educated, and the purpose of education was basically to teach you how to think and reason and to receive information, process it, and work through it. And that was also within the church. We used to elaborate on the key points, the non-negotiables. What are the non-negotiables of our faith? And we made sure that everyone, through catechism or through whatever it was, that communion process was that we focused on that, and that's changed. And to the point that one of the commenters on one of the articles made this incredible statement. And this is a pastor, and he said, "My people don't share their faith because they don't know their faith. They have no idea what they really believe or how it applies to the questions they face. So they remain," and listen to this, "so they remain silent, insecure, and ashamed." And, I have to, in our church, we often talk about the 80-20.
Sure. Yeah.
That at your little classes, how far are you reaching into the body of fellowship within your church?
Right.
You're getting in maybe 20% at best. I mean, there may be, and you may have different things that reach to different bits of that 100% at different times. But I think we do have this problem within the church that we tend to think that it's monolithic, and it's hardly. And we have people at all different levels of spiritual maturity coming through. And how do we handle that? And it's really a challenge.
Well, the Catholic Church handled it very simply, as did the Anglicans, and that was that as you approach the church for membership, it's a requirement. I mean, as a bishop, I wouldn't do a confirmation with somebody who had not been through the catechism of the church and had a clear understanding. So there was a gate, there was a place where you entered in, and the place where you entered in, I'm not talking about baptismal ecclesiology here, I'm talking about entering into the fullness of membership of a church, and you had to know that.
It's funny, though, what we're seeing in many churches now, many pastors will say it, well, we don't believe in membership anymore. You don't join a local church. You're just part of the greater church, and so you can just come in and hang out with us for a while, and hopefully you'll catch some of the infection of the church. And so there is this we're seeing it in the modern church. That's what we're talking about, right? We're seeing that by abandoning some of those the structure that we had that came up through the decades, the generations, really, that there's been a lacking. We've lost something in that process. So how we repair that, I'm not sure, but it's really remarkable. I mean, I find this so true that the youth coming up, they have Google. They can Google an answer.
Yes.
If they want an answer, they'll go to Google before they come to me. Or to their parents, asking for spiritual information, and it's a completely different world now.
Yeah, and we also have the lack of, you mentioned it before, the classical education. I mean, it used to be for probably our parents all read Pilgrim's Progress in school. I'm sitting looking at Ross, who is a producer here, who grew up in a Catholic education and went to Catholic school, and so I'm sure he went through the catechisms as well too. And we are lacking some of those fundamental foundation blocks of that.
Well, we've had to lower the bar, Ben. I mean, the way people stumble in and out of churches right now, you have to have a pretty low bar so they could stumble in and get out. When people leave churches, we rarely even mention that they've gone.
Right. When
people come in, we barely recognize that they've come. It's a stumble in and stumble out mentality right now, and setting high bars doesn't work. Let's face facts. In a Protestant world, at least, where people are looking for a new church on the average of every 3 or 4 years, you don't want to set a very high bar. Because if you set a high bar, they're likely to go to the one that's next door. And so it's a matter of preservation.
And how much of this is acquiescence to the culture of numbers, though? They don't want to have the numbers up in a church. Right, Karl?
Right. I mean, one of the things that we do in the United Methodist Church is we count. We count numbers. We fill out tables. We turn them in, and they're a very useful tool. But I agree with you, Ben. I think sometimes we focus too much on the numbers. And
not on discipleship.
And not on discipleship. And I think the pastor then also has a very great responsibility that when they present a message on Sunday, not only does that message have to talk about some biblical truth, but we need to also be teaching people what it is that we believe. I mean, it's great to stand up and tell a great sermon, a great story about the prodigal son, and move everybody to tears. But they need more than that. They also need to know this is why this matters, because this is what we believe.
Well, and of course the challenge is getting all that in 45 minutes. And,
in how long?
Yeah, I mean, that's, 20 for some, and little sermonettes. I mean, it's really tough. And so you have to try to bring them in at different times. But, we have, Ben, just to reply to you, we have bent to the culture. And so we wonder, everybody's all got their arms up about this new nuns category, NONESs.
Right.
Well, that's who they are.
Yeah.
They have no idea what the true meaning of the church is. They're just showing up. And so I'm going to stretch this out so that I can get the last word on this, and no one else will have an opportunity to speak but me. But
except
that's
for
just
me.
the way I roll, Ben.
That's because I cut off your mic. And we'll have more to come in a moment here on Faith Matters here on the Talk Station. Hey, welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station. I'm Ben Ball, and thanks for joining us here today on FM 107 and AM 1240, along with Reverend Karl Zarowski and also Bishop Doc Loomis and Reverend Robert Cornegie, as we talk about some other things that are coming up. And one was a somewhat of a surprise when the Nobel Committee announced their Nobel Prize in Literature. The reaction, if you've seen the video, the reaction was, oh, okay. It's like shock, and then they were okay with it because the Nobel Prize in Literature this year went to Bob Dylan. Now, why should we talk about Robert Zimmerman, his birth name? Why should we talk about Bob Dylan, who's from, where's he from, like Minneapolis or outside there, Minnesota, I think. And in this regard, well, he has gone down an interesting faith path in a number of ways. He was... a lot of people thought he was born Jewish, but he was actually baptized a Christian. He actually, there were folks who called him a Jewish cowboy for a long time. But then at one point, I believe it was in the 80s, 1980, his book, he had an album out called Saved. And this was right after he had a conversion experience. And so since then, it's been kind of a mix with him of which kind of is like a lot of us, actually, a mix of the Christian and secular. So, Robert, I know that you're a big music fan too. Probably, were you a Bob Dylan fan?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he was one of my buddies. I mean, that whole folk genre of music was just huge, and Joan Baez and all that crowd. Oh yeah, I was right in the middle of that. And so when he came out, I mean, came out as a Christian, it was fantastic. I was a brand new Christian too, and so I remember the song "You Got to Serve Somebody." And that was just fantastic. I had a track. What do you call those things?
Right.
8-track.
In 1980, you still had an 8-track.
Yeah, I had an 8-track of Dylan hits.
But the songs always, as with many of the folk genre, though, often called on religious metaphors or imagery, etc.
That's a great point.
Yeah, so it wasn't unusual. Even his, like All Along the Watchtower, you get those references there. You have in Thunder on the Mountain is one that was a much later one in 2006. But you have back in the earliest folk days, of Pete Seeger days too, where they were calling on what was then considered the more, what do I say, earth friendly side of religion at the beginning of the eco movement. There was a lot of that was coming from the folk world. Now, Doc, were you a Bob Dylan fan, or you were interested in that music at all?
No. Much more.
Okay, I'll move on.
Much more in the Lawrence Welk genre of music. Popular around the same time, but it was more family friendly, and I could understand what they were saying, and that was big in my house. We liked Mitch Miller. We liked the boys that sang on the Lawrence Welk show. That was pretty much it. And of course, Guy Lombardo and the Royal Canadians when we wanted to get rock and roll.
Yes, or on the Lawrence Welk show when they sang "One Took Over the Line."
One Took Over the Line, one of the great moments in Lawrence Welk show history.
I'll never forget it.
Yeah. No, I really was not a big Bob Dylan fan. He just there was nothing about him that really resonated with me. And the older he got, the more distant he became from me, because it was like he was singing into a glass through a hairbrush with a paper eardrum on it, and descending with the Doppler effect down the street to the point where eventually he just kind of, what the world is he even talking about?
I figured we'd have an
I
invitation.
mean, not exactly what you call a clear Christian witness, you know. I don't know what he's saying.
All right, Karl. I know you're a musician too.
You're not right, Doc. You're just not right. No, I was a big Bob Dylan fan. I'm still a big Bob Dylan fan. And I know when I was in college at the design school at NC State about the time that he came out and said that he was saved. And at the time, I was not. I was interested in learning about Jesus. I was kind of feeling that pull of grace towards him, but I hadn't made any commitment at all at that point. But to hear on the radio that Bob Dylan had done this, and then I start listening to some of these songs like "You've Got to Serve Somebody,"
Yeah.
and I feel like maybe even through that music, God was using what Bob Dylan had done to draw me in closer to him. And I have to wonder how many other people had that same experience. That, who led you to the Lord? Well, it was Bob Dylan. Now, I'm not going to say Bob Dylan led me to the Lord, but can I say that God used him as one of the factors that did?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think with Dylan, I wasn't a huge fan, but I always liked lyrically, and usually I like the covers. Versions better than his own version of a song.
Right.
But lyrically, there was, and this is what the Nobel Committee was recognizing, is that lyrically it explored ways of speaking of talking to the human condition, which is part of their effort, in ways that people weren't doing before. It wasn't just like Michael rowed the boat ashore. It was speaking about more esoteric and ethereal.
The answer, my friend.
Yes.
Right.
Is
And
blowing
Dylan,
in the wind.
Yeah.
Dylan was, I look at Dylan, I think he's a fine musician, a wonderful musician. I love his music. But I could sit and read an entire volume of just his lyrics without the music, and I could be touched in a very big way. I mean, he was a poet. So when I heard that he got the award, I wasn't surprised at all. I said, wow. What an awesome choice to receive the Nobel Prize.
Back in those days, I was listening to music. Back in those days, I was pretty big into music and of a lot of genres. Though the cover versions, I'd say, so that's what he was saying, because I was like you, Doc, so I couldn't really understand what he was saying. But the cover version, the Peter, Paul, and Mary version, you could hear that one, you could tell that. But
I liked it because the guy with a bad voice was able to make it, and that gave me hope that maybe one day I could.
But in this, in talking about this, I think the primary reason I even wanted to include this was that he does reflect the struggles a lot of people have. They may have a conversion experience. I know I had one when I was 12 and then ran from that. So people may have those experiences, but they're not, similar to our discussion before, they're not willing to spend the time to get into the depth of it, or then they're afraid of it. They may have fear of what have they done, who's going to hang around them anymore. And Dylan experienced some of that. He had some people that, one, they didn't believe it, for one thing. They were skeptical of his conversion, but also then didn't want to be part of his circle any longer.
Well, he kind of speaks to it right here. He says, He said, "I've never said that I'm born again. That's just a media term." He said, "I don't think I've been an agnostic. I've always thought there's a superior power, that this is not the real world and that there's a world to come." And so, so that's sort of that universal, position on it. But evidently, when after a divorce, some people in his group, in his close circle, who were Christians, had shared their faith with him, and he had responded very positively to it, obviously. So, all right, we'll give him an award. I mean, look, they're handing those things out like candy now, so may as well get Bob Dylan in there too.
Yeah. Well, this was actually the first one for American to win a Nobel Prize in Literature for quite a while. I forgot who the last one, but it's been quite some time. And first time, really, you see one who is do you put him first as a poet? I think, Karl, you would. Poet, and secondly as a musician. Yeah. And that would have been their consideration, too.
Yeah, well, the music was the instrument of his poetry, if I put it that way. That's what got him the acclaim, was that it was popular, and it was able to get out through that book of poetry by Bob Dylan. I mean, if he had just done that and not had the musical element, we may not even know of him.
And I think with Dylan, yes, you listen to it for the music, because great musician. But when you listen to Dylan, you're not listening to the music. You're listening to what he has to say.
Correct. That's right.
And I think a lot of people, we were talking before about not having a witness. A lot of people have difficulty in forming their witness story, and maybe sometimes it needs to be lyrical. It needs to be a way of expressing it in music or in poetry, other than because their own words, their own life experiences aren't captured well in just common speech, common prose.
I think we need to go back to the monastic chanting of our testimonies and whatnot. I think that here on the show
we could have Doc lead the way with that.
Well, this is a good time to segue to the award that we've just won, the Mikey Award for radio in Eastern Carolina. A lot of people will not be aware that Faith Matters won a Mikey for the best radio programming in Eastern Carolina between the hours of 8 and 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings. It's a pretty high thing, and they don't pass these out like candy.
It's a hot slot.
It's a pretty hot slot. That's right.
That's right.
So, tell your friends you're listening to award-winning radio right now.
Yeah.
Well, that probably was a better close than having Doc do his Dylan imitation again.
One more time, please. Come on, please. One more.
You're going to have to serve somebody.
And that, fortunately, will wrap us up for this week here on Faith Matters.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.